Hey everybody, how's it going? Andrew here, and I just wanted to make a quick announcement to say that we are currently reaching out to you, our listeners, and other devs as well, to see if you'd be interested in being on the show for a new type of episodes we're going to be launching soon. So, what this new episode is basically we'll be doing mini kind of like one-on-one consultations where you can ask a question that you have about your marketing, and we will address it and provide guidance for it as part of the show. There will be several other devs with you for that format too, and then we'll also provide some commentary in addition to that. So that's going to be the format. I think it's a great opportunity for you guys to ask your questions and then also be featured on the show to share a little bit more about your project and what you're working on. So if this is something that is interesting for you and you'd love to be on the show, then head over to rengenmarketing.com dev interviews, and you can fill out the form with your question and we'll be getting back to you. Now, in case that there's a large influx of inquiries, please be patient as we give it time to get back to you. But again, that site is rengenmarketing.com/dev interviews, and sign up if you're interested in being on the show. All right, that's all I got for that. Thank you again for being such great listeners, and let's get back to the show. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today along with Mustapha Price, and this is episode 257, where we're going to be talking about how indie devs can clarify their messaging. Now, when you start sharing your game with the world, everything you do from then on deals with messaging. While you may have a good idea on what your studio and game are, sometimes how you convey that to others isn't in the most clear or concise way. That's why Mustapha and I are here to help discuss how important it is to clarify your messaging and some tips on ways you can do that. So when you start promoting your game, people have a clear idea on exactly what to expect from you. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, we're back, and I have Mustapha here with me today. Mustapha, how's it going, buddy?
Going well. Feels like it's been a while since I've been on one of these, so I'm excited to be back.
Yes, I think it has been some time. So, and of course, I'm happy to have you here too, because we have a pretty interesting topic that we'd love to talk about today. But before we get into that, let's catch up with you, man, because last time you talked, you had a lot of different things going on. So, how has that been going? How's life been treating you? Give us the down low on everything.
Yeah. Still a whole lot of things going on, which, that's always a good thing. For my team, we kind of recently introduced a major new mechanic into our games, so it has been nonstop design work, balancing, drafting things up and tweaking old things. So we're in an exciting position. We think this will kind of give an added hook to the game that we're working on, but it has certainly been a time sink, so making games is hard, as it were.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, that's cool. I mean, it sounds like you guys are making a lot of progress and stuff, and just plugging right along. That's great.
Yeah, it's super exciting. How about you? What's been new?
Not too much. It's just crazy summer, especially August. A lot of projects that are getting like fully ramped and everything. And also just apparently August is also the time that my family decided to do just lots of vacations. Nothing huge or extravagant, but like it seems like every weekend there's something going on. There's birthdays, there's people going back to school. It's just because I don't know if I've mentioned, but my wife's a teacher. She goes back to school. The kids go back to school. Everybody goes back to school.
Yeah.
I mean, that time of the year. So it's just a bit of hectic craziness and everything else. But otherwise, it's been good. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell, I guess, for what's been happening recently. So, in addition to that, though, I'm curious, what games have you been playing?
What games have I been playing? So, I've been back to basics lately, and I have been playing an absolute ton of
A ton of Tetris?
Tetris. So I got Tetris Effect, which
Ooh.
was visual, like music themed version of it. I got back into Tetris 99, which is like the battle royale version on the Switch, and then I've been playing Puyo Puyo Tetris, which is also on the Switch. So a whole lot of Tetris in my life lately.
Oh
It's
my.
super easy to play in short bursts, and I don't have to worry about like coming off the heels of like I had played all the Yakuza games this year, and those are like dozens and dozens of hours, so it was nice to have something I can just kind of sit down with, play, and then get back to work kind of thing.
Nice. And real quick, for whatever reason, I think the audio cut out, but the first Tetris you mentioned with the music and such, that was Effect, correct?
Yes,
Oh,
Tetris Effect.
okay.
Mhm.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to just clearly state that because it sounded like we cut out there for a minute. But man, that's awesome. Like so much Tetris. I remember seeing Tetris Effect for the first time and was like, wow, I could get back into this game again. Not to say
Yeah.
Tetris is a bad game or anything. Just you're once you know it and you've played it for so long, even as a kid, it's like, yeah, it's the same thing. So, but
Oh yeah.
not
Yeah.
with
No, I
Effect.
totally get that. But Tetris Effect is definitely a new take, well worth anyone's time for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, that's one I'll have to get into some point. But anyways, on my front, yeah, still not much has changed. I'm still like, and actually lately I haven't been like playing anything at all. But top of my list primarily is Final Fantasy One. It's what is it? I think I'm about halfway through based off of what the average playthrough is for the full game, which I think is like 20 hours, which I find so hard to believe for an old NES game like that. But
Yeah.
that's pretty cool though that there's that much playtime. So, anyways, I'm about halfway through. I need to plug through that because, as I've mentioned before here on the show, it's now my official challenge and potentially like, I guess, bucket list item. I'm giving myself, I think, more than enough time, I hope, but to play through all the Final Fantasies. So, yeah, I just need to commit myself and start playing one again so I can move on because as much as I'm enjoying one, I'm ready to move on. And from what some of my friends are telling me, they're like, why are you doing that to yourself? All of them up to 5 suck. Like, I'm like, nope. I'm gonna do it. So don't
Well,
rain on
depending
my
on how
parade.
long it takes you, they're like remastering the original 6, I think, for mobile and Steam.
So and that's part of my thing too. I'm trying to make sure or find ways, and I'm playing the originals.
Mhm.
At least, I mean, I don't know if I'll play remasters later, but I'm playing at least. I'm trying to play the games as I grew up with them.
Okay.
I think
I
for the
see.
best representation of like, because yeah, that's basically my objective there. Because I've thought that, for example, with one, and I'll cheat a little bit, and this is what I mean by cheating. I'll use the internet to find out what the heck spells are, because I have no clue half the time. What does lit mean, right? I mean, you can figure
Yeah.
it out, but what does it could mean something completely different. In some cases, that is the case. And then on top of it all, you find out like, oh yeah, that game was released with a bug for that spell, and it doesn't even work. And it's
Mm.
like, I did a grind for all this skill, all this time, just so I could get a spell that does not work.
Mhm.
And you have limited spell slots too. So, anyways, that's what I'm doing. I need to make some time, maybe this weekend. Probably not, because again, it's another busy weekend. But whatever. Here we are. All right. Enough about what we're playing, and more about what we are talking about today. And that is, as we mentioned earlier, how indie devs can clarify their messaging. So, Mustafa, how are we going to kick off this conversation today?
Yeah, well, I would say, it's really about assessing the value of what we're discussing first and foremost, right?
Hmm.
So messaging is something that is going to be pervasive throughout the entire process of discussing your game with the world at large. That could be even before your marketing campaign. That could be from the time you start having conversations with other people in the space. So, ensuring that you have a good grasp on what your studio represents and your game, uh, it's important to learn how to convey that in a way that feels consistent and clear across the board. Um, so we're kind of hoping to discuss ways in which you can promote your game that are going to be, again, clear and consistent. So again, with assessing that value, I guess if I, I didn't go over it, in depth enough, uh, why would we say it's important to review and clarify your messaging with everything that you do?
Yeah, no, it's a really really great and important thing to discuss in terms of why. Like, why is that, right? So there's a few reasons that I would think on my end. Um, like short and sweet answer to that is like people just need to know what your intentions are. And that could go in a lot of different directions, right? So one way I see this is just who are these people? So at face value, or in general, we tend to think, oh, they're our players. They need to know what we're making and things like that, right? And but especially when it comes down to like branding and what you represent as a brand and things like that. That's really important because if they have a clear idea on what you do and what you represent, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment, that can really have an impact on them. But in other areas too, such as like when if you are going to working with a publisher, if they have a clear idea on what those things are, because so overall, just making sure that people know what your intentions are, what you represent, things like that. It's gonna really help them kind of align with whether or not you're a company or you have a product that they're gonna want to be interested in. So that's really what I think it would come down to is why is it clear? It's because if you're not clear with everything that you're doing from a messaging perspective, it can cause confusion. It can cause people not to take action or do the things that you ultimately want them to do. And the reason why this is so important to say, because some people might be out there thinking, oh, my messaging is clear, but is it? And that's part of what we're going to like be discussing about today, because making sure that it is clear and not just thinking that you think it's clear is very imperative, because there can be a stark contrast. And if you don't know that, it can be really scary.
Yeah, no, that's excellently put. And just to kind of, I would say, expand on that. When we had Chevy from Happy Ray Games, the devs of Eichenfeld, on the show back in I think February,
Mm-hmm.
um, there was a lot of discussion around just the sheer volume of communication channels that are active throughout the development process, and it's easy to think that like brand messaging is exclusive to how you engage with your audience or your player base, but it really expands so much further than that. I mean, you have to represent your studio again if you're having conversations with publishers, if you're hiring contractors to work with you, if you are onboarding community management staff, if you're, even beyond that, I would say when you're publishing the game, even if you're doing that independently, the parties that you work with for having the games on specific platforms, knowing which collaborators are going to align with what you want, making sure that applicants to your team or people who are aiming to assist you know what you're about, so that way you can ensure you're only bringing on people who align with those values and that messaging. Like, it is such a webbed network that you're going to be exchanging with at any given time, that it is crucial to have an understanding of what your position is in that tapestry.
Yeah, you said that like perfectly, and I'm glad you said that, because when we were putting this topic together, in some of the main points that I was putting in there, I completely was just super focused on the outwardly like marketing side of things. But like that, again, it still comes down to messaging, and what you said is imperative, because think about it, like what you just said with the type of communication you're having with your team, freelancers, whoever, and how does that reflect and convey outwardly too, and through your actions and everything else. I mean, it just all comes back down to the like why it's important to have clear messaging, because if you don't, especially working with a team, then mistakes can be made, misunderstandings can happen, and how can that affect the project? How can that affect the overall interpretation from the community? There's any number of things that can come out of that. So again, clarity in your messaging is key, and I'm so glad you brought that point up, because it's something too we don't tend to think about as well. So very, very well stated.
Thank you.
So that's a great segue, I think, into, other different types of messaging. So we understand, why it's important to clarify, but what are these types of messaging? So Mustapha, you already did a great job on identifying, I would call, I guess, internal messaging or whatever. So let's see, what are some other types that you think are important that we'll start diving into a little bit more?
Yeah, I would say, categorizing into brand, product, and visual messaging, I would say is a great start. Kind of having a, we'll say, playbook for how you manage things like copy and content, visual assets, all of that stuff to ensure some sort of across the board consistency is a really good place to begin.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think starting off with the brand, as I kind of mentioned before, like a lot of people, and this is why I say this, because a lot of people don't think about themselves as a brand, as an entity getting out there. And it could be a variety of reasons. Sometimes, I mean, we can just, as human beings or whatever, we can be quite modest, and we don't want to like think about ourselves so much in that case. I mean, we still care about what we do, the work that we're doing, our passions, things like that. But when it comes to like sharing that with other people, it's like, well, that's just not me. And that's okay, but it's still important to have that messaging. And I'll break it down as to why it relates. So I mentioned before, people like to know what you represent, right? Because, and also with publishers, publishers like to know what are your goals and what are your intentions. Because here, I was talking about publishers, so let's identify part of the reason why they're. One reason, too, is they're not necessarily looking for someone to back someone with a vanity project. Sure, I mean, if it's a great project and they're interested, they'll go ahead and move forward with it. But they are also looking for relationships, and to know, like, a part of it is like, what's that driving force behind you that you're doing this? Because they're doing a lot of different risk assessments when they're increasing their portfolio. So, and that's one of the probably many other areas that they're looking at, but it's still an important factor and something for them to also consider in light of everything else. So, that's a good reason too. And if you can, and it's another great way to make a strong impression on them. But let's just say other people too. When you can identify what it is that you do, what you're passionate about, that can resonate with people and really make it clear for them and understanding, why it is something that they might want to follow with, especially for a long term. So what I would like to do is actually kind of give an example of someone who makes a statement of kind of like their core mission statement, whatever, in terms of what they want to do. And then I'll tell you who it is. So this one is, we want to make games that spark your imagination like the games you played as a kid. So very short, sweet, concise, very specific, but still not specific enough. So it's like, I mean, it's specific to a point in terms of its format, but it's also somewhat broad. And that's Supergiant. And you go on their website, and that's what they have. So I love that about them, is because it really says what they want to do as a game creator. And in a way, I think that statement also reflects, to some extent, everything that they do and that they represent within the community. And it's really important. And it's so important, in fact, I actually ingrained this is to my process whenever I'm working with someone. Then one of the questions I always have in a questionnaire I share with everybody who I'm working with is, how would you like to be known throughout the gaming community? And there's a series of other ones too that I have. But it's important because it helps me get a better understanding where they are, where they want to be, and also helps me when I'm working with people get a better understanding of where else their goals and objectives can lie, and making sure that I'm helping them guide on that process. And the reason why I share that with you is because if you go through the steps of knowing how you'd like to known throughout the community and stuff, and basically really determining what that direction is, then when you know those steps that you want to take, then you can step back and really think more about your messaging and how your actions are also going to align with your messaging, and then how that relates to everybody else, or how they interpret that. And it's really important to know, because it's helpful for you and it's helpful for everybody else. And when those two things align, you're more likely to hit that goal that you want to be striving for. So
yeah, I there were a couple of points in there that I found to be really interesting, and I especially want to call back to Supergiant, because when you think about like how specific their statement is, of course, it is a nod to trying to appeal to a specific feeling that a lot of people in this community can relate to. But you particularly comment on how it's also vague enough where it doesn't pigeonhole them into making one singular type of experience. And to kind of harp on that consistency, there are similarities across Supergiant games, but no two of them are really the same, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they are very much individually crafted experiences that almost all bring their own elements to play. And I think when you keep that in mind, it's really not easy, obviously, because not everybody can do it as well, but it is possible to create this sense of brand identity where you know what your position is in the industry and the specific type of conversation you want to evoke through action, while still remaining broad enough where you don't have to lock yourself into creating a singular type of experience or having to be known as like the company that makes this type of game. Like you can still keep it open enough where people know what you're about, but they also know they can still be surprised by you.
Yeah. And it definitely, because I think having that sense of, how do I want to say this? I guess sense of unknown, or like you said, having that element of surprise is important. Because here's the other thing with their statement too, as you kind of pointed out, like it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't pigeonhole. If they need a pivot in for whatever different direction, they feel the need to or want to, they're able to probably do that and still align with that messaging. So even if they take like a different approach to some of the games that they're making and whatnot, it's probably still going to fit in there, but still keep to that core value, and that core value that resonates with their audience is a good one to stay on top of and everything, which is like games you played as a kid. And that's a value for some people, but it's also like a clear identification of who their audience is too. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So let's switch it up a little bit and talk about some other types here. So we got we mentioned about descriptions, and then and then visual media assets and things like that. So what is it about short and long descriptions, more specifically, that you think can become problematic if people aren't really paying attention to them?
Right. Okay. So you're probably gonna have to cut me off because this is like my area of expertise. But language is a thing that I think because it is so second nature to us, right? Specifically, our first language, that we don't notice really when we're making massive linguistic mistakes.
Mm,
um, Especially because a lot of them, our eyes are trained to kind of gloss over. And I'm not talking about like spelling or grammatical errors. I'm really talking about errors of communication. And I can be kind of verbose sometimes, so I'm very much guilty of this. But like in the world of like writing and publishing, you have what's referred to often as purple prose, which is words for the sake of using words. It's using language to show people how impressively descriptive you can be and how much of a picture you can paint for them. But that's not always the most efficient way. And particularly, I think the fact that a lot of times games can be kind of drawn to this is a result of trying to emulate those other industries. And that especially doesn't work in ours because games are an interactive medium that, by their inherent nature, in order to interest someone in your game, yes, premise can be a driving factor, but they have to be able to decipher a fundamental understanding of core mechanics through reading a paragraph or two. And so being concise and having a real clear understanding of what your game is and, in a sense, why your game is, I think is far more important than the kind of colorful descriptions that we're used to on the backs of books or DVD cases.
yeah, I love how you phrase that, and because basically you, and this is from your expertise too, and everything. Like phrasing it that way puts it back into a context of this is kind of how we're used to working, whether it's like culturally related or societally related. We have this understanding of how things should be, and then next thing you know, you're realizing, oh, but it can really convolute and not make things clear. So getting that idea and mindset, because and this is essentially what you're saying too, to agree. What you think might be might be acceptable or okay, or you're like, oh yeah, this makes complete sense, could be very far from the truth, and it happens all the time with like everybody. And it takes time and energy. Like for example, I remember, I think I probably shared this at one point. I went to film school, and a lot of my focus was on screenwriting. But up until that point, or prior to going to film school, I did a lot of learning where I would like write like simple scripts and stuff. And man, if you look at the stuff, it's like super long prose, and that was just what I was used to. But then in time, but scripts in particular, you're writing dialogue. People don't generally have conversations with each other in very like long, like very smart ways, or like being very just overly descriptive. It's really short and sweet and to the point. And if you look at a film that has a lot of that type of stuff, you're like, you get bored pretty quickly. But if you look at this nice punchy stuff, it's engaging.
Right. And the thing about it is like this as an idea is fairly fluid, right? I mean, if you're making, I don't know, if you are Nintendo making the next Mario Party, you probably don't want to dedicate a whole bunch of real estate to writing about what makes this Mario Party super different. You want to use words like fun, party, family, friends, like that type of stuff. Just make sure those types of words are in people's faces so they get the general idea of what you're going for.
Yeah.
But if you're making an in-depth RPG, perhaps something even like a tabletop RPG or something like that, then yeah, you probably do want to add some of that flavor language, get a little bit more in depth with it, because those things are probably going to be less intimidating to your target audience anyway. But if you're making a party game or you're making something that's intended to be more accessible, you have to make sure, like again, with the consistency of branding and messaging, that it is designed with that accessibility in mind, from the way the game is made all the way down to how you're writing your descriptions.
Yeah. I couldn't say it better myself. So probably on top of that, just be like, it can be case by case, but still having that consistency, and also continuing to be concise in general as it relates to your product and your audience is just really going to clearly, give that messaging and what you want people to do, like just really be able to clarify that so people don't have any question whatsoever when they move forward. So, so we talked about some descriptions, and I love how again, like you just bring up the topic of making it accessible, having that accessible language, because it's sometimes we just don't think about that as being a potential issue, but it's a big one as we identify. But moving along in terms of messaging, another one that we mentioned is just a visual form of messaging. So like, what are some things that you've come across, if any, off the top of your head, in ways that you've seen messaging, visual messaging? And again, we're talking about media assets here, so videos and images, screenshots. But have you ever come across any that you're kind of like, okay, what am I looking at here?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the examples that come to mind are from companies big enough where, like, their messaging almost matters a lot less. But, like, for visual assets, for example, I think of kind of the infamous example of, it was for a movie. It was for Spider-Man Homecoming. And I don't know if it was, like, a poster or what, but it had, like, Spider-Man in the suit, and then like Iron Man flying next to him, and then Peter Parker in the background without the mask, and then Tony kind of standing behind him. It was just a very noisy image that didn't really do anything to convey like what the movie was about. But of course, it was from one of the largest, most lucrative film franchises in the world, so nobody really cared. But
they're like, Spider-Man movie, yay!
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think a little bit closer to home. Good thing is, I guess, for a lot of the indies that I've played recently, I can't really think of examples where visual media wasn't adequately conveying what they were going for. So I think to kind of go on the opposite end of the spectrum, some things that I think were exceptionally well handled in way of visual assets. Fall Guys has like some of the best like pre-rendered content out there. Like every video they release is so much more like in the spirit of the game than it is, say, a one-to-one translation of how the game actually looks and plays. Like they have their characters do simple things like emote more in their videos and stuff like that to kind of show the like competitive, friendly, fun nature of the game. I think Among Us is another great example. A lot of their visual media is like very comical in nature, even though the game is set in kind of these like perilous situations. It's obviously intended, especially now, to be very widely accessible, and so there's a lot of like comedy to their visual assets, and I'm sure there's a whole lot that goes into that because I know Victoria is kind of doing a lot of their community management stuff now, or communications directing stuff rather.
Yeah.
But yeah, like those are some examples I think are really strong.
Yeah, and that's I like how you mentioned that too, because it is a somewhat different approach in terms of form of messaging. Like, because in that it's not necessarily like in some of those images and stuff that I'm like somewhat recalling in my head right now. It may not necessarily be a direct relation to the product in terms of like specifics, right? Because as you said, it's a lot of like humor oriented, even though it's a bit, but because that's overall kind of the overall like tone that game has been setting is more humor related, because of like the audience's reaction and things like that. So that form of messaging is really important, I think, because it helps convey maybe more of the experience and mood than like, because if you were to say what actually happens in the game, like a quick short description, it might not necessarily represent what the experience is really like or how the experience has formed and become, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like an involved one. So it's interesting. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's one that we probably don't look at maybe too often, or we just look at it and kind of like think of it as like the norm to some degree, because we're already familiar with it. Now, another way I like to look at it too, in different ways I look at this, in terms of areas where I feel that imagery can be kind of convoluted, kind of to a degree, especially when it comes to like video is a little bit better in terms of providing that context, in terms of like gameplay and things like that. But when you get a screenshot, sometimes you could be completely lost. And where I see this the most, it could be anywhere, honestly, but where I see this the most is Twitter. And understandably so. People grab a screenshot, put it up. You can sometimes see it in Steam too. And people are just trying to populate those areas and show progress, whatever, promote. They're just trying to get it out there. But what I see happen sometimes in terms of how the messaging and the visual messaging is conveyed is people might not. They think more of the task or executing the task opposed to what is going to be, how is that conveyed, or what is the interpretation of that image. And what I mean specifically is, and I know from firsthand, because I've had my share of trying to get screenshots for clients too, where if you take a screenshot, you're like, okay, we need a screenshot of this new level that we're showcasing. Great. And you grab it and throw it out there. But if you really look at it, just because the goal is to show the new level, but what's happening? Does it look like in the image? Because I've taken hundreds of images before, or where I'm like, wow, all these look like nothing is going on and it's just not interesting or whatever. So I've actually, and some of you are probably already familiar with this, but I actually had to I didn't have the control that some game developers may have with their games, where you go in and set the perfect ideal situation to make something look awesome, but you would never put a player in that actual scenario of gameplay, because it would just be brutally cruel, probably. But so what I'm talking about specifically, I was doing one where there was a character going in. It showed the level, but what it didn't show was like any engagement. Were there lasers flying around? Like what type of other things were going on? And the more that you could show with that, or to convey what is really going on in the single image, the better that image could convey to people what is going on. Because I think what also happens too, when people don't think about that process and step, and it's work, I'm not going to lie, it's definitely work, is they rely on, hey, let's get the image and then we'll provide text to go along with that. Now that is perfectly fine. However, one, like we're talking about today, is really clarifying that message. And so if you're not doing that, now you have, let's say, an image that's not very clear, and then you have a copy that's not necessarily clear, then, wow, people may really not know what's going on, what's your game about, etc. But even if you provide clear messaging, who knows at what state of mind people are going to be seeing that image. They might not even read the text that you have going with it. So if you're using imagery, you really want to make sure it's as clear as it possibly can, because that's going to be the thing, in most cases, I would assume, that people gravitate towards opposed to the text. So if all those things, and you need to make sure that they kind of align with each other. Because sometimes I see on Twitter, for example, people will post, say, hey, we did this or whatever. And at least they provide context where it's like, hey, we don't have an update, but we at least wanted to share this, right? That, whatever, that is what it is. But sometimes they'll say one thing, and then the image looks like it's showing something completely different. Now, in my head, that's causing confusion. Now I'm trying to think of, okay, what's really going on? And if I'm tired and my brain is like, you know what, you don't really want to focus too much on this because you got other things you got to worry about, I'm just going to pass right through it. And that's what it really comes down to. I think having those good, clear, and doing what you can to clarifying your visual assets in that sense making sure that when people look at it, they know exactly what the image is conveying, what it represents of your gameplay. And it's tricky. It can be, like I said, a lot of work, but it's still very important. I know that was a lot of talk about a screenshot, but
hey, screenshots are important, and like you said, sometimes we capture things that are exciting to us because we know what it took to get there. But for a player, they're probably just going to see what's actually in front of them.
Yeah,
because they don't have the context of your development history with whatever screenshot you're taking.
It's just like anything that you have ever done. Like, have you ever like created reports for work, or you had to present something, whatever? You put all this time and energy in it, and then in the end, it's like for I remember some agencies I worked for. Like, there was times that it would take me hours to put together some reports for certain slides, but the presentation that the company was giving to this organization, they only had a time limit of maybe like 5 minutes, where each slide could have taken me an hour or two to put together. Because of getting all the data and information stuff. But that's an extreme example, but that's kind of to the point. Because again, like in those types of situations, you need to clearly provide information in a short format, even though it might take you a little bit extra time. But in a lot of cases, it's definitely worth it. I'll go off a quick tangent. I met with a friend recently, and he's an engineer. I don't know exactly what the company's for, but he's basically designing systems to cool off like servers, okay? But the people who are in charge, they know nothing what goes on, or the mechanics or the engineering that goes behind it. They just want to know, like, what is it going to do and what's the bottom line, right? So he had to put together something that, like, almost in a way, a very advanced or somewhat different form of technology than it currently exists to do the thing they need to do. Cool off these servers, because cooling them off, less time for them to age and die or whatever, saving money. So basically how we described it is what this new form of technology was basically, you could describe any cooling mechanism whatsoever that already exists. In numerous cases, but in their eyes, they're like, "Oh wow, that's really cool. That it does that. We like it." And then when they start presenting other things in their thing, what they're basically doing is giving the information to people, and then because it's aligning with what they're capable of understanding and accepting, then they can now start conversations. So his goals and objectives can be met for projects that he wants to do, because he conveyed it in a way that other people understand, and the people that are the ones that will greenlight projects like that, he conveyed it in a format that they understood. So taking this back to games, what does that mean? Again, simplifying things so people understand what you want them to do, what you're trying to show them, so then they now have the information in as simple format as possible to say, yeah, I like that game. I'm going to go wishlist it. I'm going to go buy it, whatever the case is. And that's really what it comes down to, and why it's simplification. So like I said, that was a tangent, but it's just giving another example on why the importance of simplifying things, even if it's to the point where you're like, wow, these people aren't that smart, but that's okay. And it's not a matter of smart. It's more of a matter of time, energy, resources people have when they're looking at your stuff. So you want to make sure it's super short and sweet, so they're not questioning what they're looking at, that they know. Okay, so we're coming close on time here, so I want to start wrapping up with some other conversations. Like, we talked about the importance, essentially, and the types to a good amount of detail with how to make messaging clear, with messaging, the importance and everything. But what are some ways that we can share with people how to make messaging clearer? So with that said, Mustapha, what are some good places to start to really help clarifying your messaging?
Yeah, well, the best place to start is the beginning. Go back to what you've already done and review that. It's revising is a constant process. It's not something you just do and then it's done. You kind of work on it iteratively as much as you possibly can. So go back, review your previous messaging, and then another thing is, of course, to look at those who have done it before. We provided an example with Supergiant. it's worth looking at studios you like and seeing how they do their branding, where the consistencies are. What are words that you see in common across disparate projects that they've done? All sorts of things that you can review to determine how these other companies and other studios and everything are approaching their work.
Yeah, no, the great ways to go about it. And again, like, and as you're probably very familiar with the revision process, and because that's imperative. And trying to, I think this is a hard part some people face, is trying to like remove yourself from it, because you're in your game, you're making it, you're in the trenches, in the weeds, so it's really easy to when you're that close to something, it's very easy to think like, oh, everything looks fine, right? But like, what I ask myself when I'm going through these exercises and things, and helping people with their messaging, I try to step back. It's like, always think about, what would someone say? What would someone think if they saw this for the first time? So when you're reviewing your own messaging and revising it, I would take that step back and be like, pretend you are just seeing that short description or just seeing that screenshot for the very first time. It doesn't make sense to you. And again, it can be a challenge sometimes and take some like work to get to that point where you can really identify things. But if you're always asking yourself that question, you're going to look at it. You can look at it with a much clearer lens, outside of like, the in the weeds stuff that you're so used to, and then you can start really answering. Oh yeah, I do know what that means. And it's like, or you could be like, oh, I have no idea what I was talking about there. That's happened to me several times too. And like you said too, I think a great idea is looking at how other games and other studios describe and giving you an idea of that. Another thing I'd like to share, and this is actually something that I have used myself. It doesn't relate to gaming at all in terms of, I mean, it relates to everybody, to be honest. Anybody who's like running a business, essentially. It's actually the process that I actually used when I updated my website to have more clear messaging. It's a book by Donald Miller called Building a Story Brand. It has you, I highly recommend it because it has you go through various exercises, specifically identifying like pain points and things like that, all key important things. It's a little bit, it's kind of like identifying like a player persona in a sense, but in a more concise, simple format. It's a bit of an exercise, but when you get through it, it can really help determine better messaging. Highly recommend that book. I'm not going to go into any more details about it other than I will put it in the show notes. That's a great process to really help you better identify, how to make clear messaging. Now, one thing I also want to talk about real quickly too, in terms of more specifically how to create concise messaging with like short descriptions. And this could be applied long too. One is, I would just write whatever's top of mind after your revision process and everything, narrow it down, and just kind of go with there and asking others what they think and stuff. But when you're trying to come up with a very short description that gives everything that you need, this is what I do. In terms of things that I have identified and that are important to have are 4 characteristics, and those are a story element and or objective. It's kind of like 3 things, but I'll explain how those can differentiate from each other. But a story element to your game, an objective element, mechanic, and then the genre. Those, I think, are the 4 main things that you want to like really nail down for your description. And because having those elements really help clarify what the game is about. So I'll give another example here of who does this amazingly well. And you can probably guess what the game is and obviously the creator. But this is the description. Defy the god of the dead as you hack and slash out of the underworld in this roguelike dungeon crawler. Though that description alone consists of basically all those elements. And I didn't even read the full description because the last part of it is from the creators of Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. So we know it's Supergiant. But to the point, like they hit on all those elements so well for the game Hades. And that's what I've been able to identify that is great, because just from reading that alone, you have a clear sense of what the story is about, what your objective is, the mechanic, hack and slash essentially. So is this like a simple one to kind of do that, but also the roguelike with the genre. I mean, and dungeon crawl, like it just gives so much packed information in just one small sentence.
And I would even add to that to say, like, one thing that's really impressive about this description is that if you recall from earlier in the show, we had mentioned we want to make games that spark your imagination, like the games you played as a kid. And then this particular description for Hades is actually very genre focused. It's hack and slash, which is a genre in its own right, roguelike, dungeon crawler. Like, when we had the conversation about accessibility of language earlier, it is very clear that Hades is not the type of game you expect, fans of Wii Sports to get into.
Exactly. Yep.
It is it's very obviously a game made for people who like video games, and the genre focus not only helps to further exemplify that, but it aligns perfectly with their mission statement, because it calls back to genres of old that people played when they were younger, like Rogue,
Yeah. So, like, see how, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because, again, what we mentioned before with consistency and everything, consistency doesn't necessarily just mean you're going to use the same messaging and maybe tweak it a little bit because of the character limitations and different platforms you could put it on and stuff. It's not so much about that. It's how does your messaging for you as a brand also align with that, and how does with your game description, and how does your game description messaging align with other things in other formats, like the example Mustapha provided earlier with why can't I think of it? Not Fall Out Guys, Among Us, and the messaging and the tone that they set for that. See, so that's what it means with consistency, and that's why I also share that whole book with you, building a story brand, because the characteristics in that book or the examples that they and guidelines that they provide you with in there helps you determine and really figure out how to align your messaging in all those different ways too. So again, thank you for pointing that out, Mustapha, because again, it really comes down to where else can you align and create consistency. And that's the thing, like, yes, this is work. If some of you are thinking about like, oh, that sounds like it's a lot of work. Well, it is. But like, when you start creating these foundations and things and these mindsets moving forward, it's just going to make you stronger. And that's why we're going into such detail and really emphasizing these points about that. So, but yeah, so just to wrap that part up though, it's that is what I would suggest. Quick thing, if you're really looking to nail those short descriptions, those are way. Now, you don't have to have every fourth thing that I mentioned, because sometimes you might not necessarily show your mechanic that much. I will read off one more example that kind of is a little bit more mechanic focused, and that's from the game Wizard of Legend. And they simply say, so check them out on Steam if you need this, unless they've changed it recently. But Wizard of Legend is a no-nonsense, action-packed take on wizardry that emphasizes precise movements and smart comboing of spells in a roguelike dungeon crawler that features over 100 of unique spells and relics. All right. Just reading that out loud, that's kind of a mouthful, right? But it is very, very, very specific and targeted and kind of mechanic heavy. So again, to Mustapha's point with what Hades did in their description, I mean, this is a little bit more heavier, but they are very specific about the genre, the mechanics. So they're clearly giving that to people who want it. And those who don't are also going to clearly identify that they don't. And that's just as helpful as not. Because the worst thing you can have is giving wrong messaging, and then people buy your game, and then they go to Steam and are like, oh, yeah, this is what I wanted. And you want nothing but positive reviews. And that's another way to kind of help one of many, of course, to kind of help with that. If you are narrowing down what your messaging is, clarifying it, so people who like it know that they'll like it, and people who wouldn't like it know as well. All right. Let's talk about lessons learned. Your favorite part, Mustapha.
Of course, of course.
So,
Oh, did you want me to lead in with the? Okay.
no, I was gonna ask you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we provided some examples, but what are some other things that you can think of on if you don't clarify your messaging, what can happen?
I think the most kind of frightening consequence of not having clear messaging is that you could potentially just kind of fade into the background. You could just become part of the zeitgeist because there's no identity associated with your brand. And so I think that's ultimately the scariest thing. You could also confuse people. You could find yourself, like I mentioned earlier, working with collaborators who don't align with the vision of your brand. You can put yourself in all sorts of positions where you are unable to properly advocate for yourself because you don't have those citable, tangible messages indicating, the identity and values of your brand or your product.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if there's just a couple of like short bullet points I'd add to that too, it's just like you could be providing kind of like what I alluded to just a moment ago. You can, give the wrong signals. If you're not really like, if you just say this is an RPG, well, RPG could also like mean a lot of different things. It can incorporate a lot of different things, different mechanics and things like that. Like, is it more tactical? Is it like action? Like, you know, that's an extreme example, but still, if you're giving the wrong examples and people who identify themselves as, and that's the thing too, sometimes people can identify themselves in this example as, I love RPGs, but what does that mean? Because I like RPGs, but a lot of them are probably going to be like more in the Final Fantasy realm of things. And yes, they have changed over the years and stuff, but still, like, that's how I define RPGs, is my interest with that IP, right? But someone else could be completely different, where it's more, let's say, RPG like Skyrim. Like, that can be, there's obviously some crossovers and whatnot, but that could be very different in what they're doing. So being more descriptive, you don't want to give those wrong.
Or Zelda, or
yeah, exactly. Any number of those things. And then just sometimes depending, like, let's say even if you're messaging with internally, like we talked about much earlier, or anywhere else, you may not get the answer you want, or you may not get the information you're looking for, or whatever that may be. So that's where, like, really clarifying and identifying those things and being concise. Because again, like, can't emphasize enough, but if you put too much detail into things, like, after a while, and I notice this a lot with like various people that I have worked with or communicated with, if you try to put too much information in one thing, they might just gravitate towards the one that's most important to them at that moment. And then you're still waiting on answers for the other stuff. But so, like, concise and simple and things like that are good. And then obviously too is just, if you like, again, kind of going back to similar points, is you can make it a challenge to properly serve your audience. And what that means is, if you know your audience and everything else and you want to serve them the right way, well, not clearly communicating your messaging can then make it a challenge for them. And you don't want to do that, because then that's when, like you say, like kind of what Mustapha said, they can start dropping off. Because they don't have a clear grasp on what you are about, or what your game's about. All right, so as we close here, Mustapha, what are some, I don't know, any other tips or suggestions that you would suggest going forward? Just pick one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My final tip would be just to be conscious of words. They have very, very specific meanings, and they empower your message in a great and major way. So always pay attention to which ones you're using.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because I still love the point you made earlier when you were discussing about making that language accessible. Because that was like right on with when you said that and relates to what you just said. Good point. I know I like to talk a lot, clearly. So I'll make it really simple with this one. Less is more. It's probably one of the most of many valuable lessons you'll learn, but less is more. Because bottom line, people are busy and have limited bandwidth. Don't make them think too much about what they're reading or what they're seeing, because if it's too much work, they're just going to move on. Less is more. All right. So that's all I have on my end. I hope you all found that this was a helpful episode. Mustafa, anything else on you?
Nope. I'd say all good on this end.
All right, great. Well, again, everyone, thanks for joining us today. And we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustapha Price. If you enjoy and value the show's content, you can support us even more by going to Patreon and visiting www.patreon.com/IGM podcast and select the tier that best suits your needs. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.